Leon Carter remained seated as the prosecutor concluded his argument, labeling him a radical responsible for inciting violence during a peaceful protest. The prosecutor painted a clear picture of the defendant as a threat, amplifying every accusation with certainty. Judge Montgomery, who had sided with the prosecution throughout the trial, maintained his unwavering gaze on Leon, clearly dismissing any defense offered. At the precise moment the prosecutor finished, Leon stood up. His posture remained composed. His gaze locked with the judge. With a voice that was both controlled and direct, he addressed the court. "Your Honor, these charges are not supported by the facts. The evidence proves otherwise. We are here because I challenged the system, and that, in your view, is a crime." The courtroom grew still, the impact of his statement immediate. The focus shifted from the prosecutor to the defendant, and all eyes were on Leon, awaiting the next step in the proceedings. The protest began with clear intent. Peaceful demonstration demanding police reform. Leon Carter, a seasoned civil rights attorney, was there not as a leader, but as a participant, encouraging others to speak out against systemic injustice. Holding a sign, he walked among the protesters, reminding them to remain calm, to respect the boundaries of peaceful assembly. The crowd stood united, raising their voices in unison, demanding change in a society they felt had long ignored them. Without warning, a line of officers appeared, led by Officer Ramirez. They advanced rapidly, pushing protesters back with excessive force. Leon, seeing the situation escalate, stepped forward, attempting to mediate. He addressed the officers directly, urging them to stand down and allow the protest to continue peacefully. His voice was steady, measured, but firm. Before he could respond further, Officer Ramirez's hand shot out, pushing him back. Leon's attempts to reason with him fell on deaf ears as the situation grew more chaotic. A scuffle broke out nearby, and in the confusion, Officer Ramirez singled out Leon. He grabbed Leon forcefully, slamming him to the ground. In a quick motion, Leon was handcuffed, his efforts to explain ignored. Officer Ramirez's face, set in contempt, revealed the harsh reality of the situation as he watched Leon being led away. The arrest was swift, almost clinical. Leon offered no resistance, but his arrest, nonetheless, marked the beginning of a legal battle that would challenge the very fabric of the justice system. This was not just an arrest, it was a message. Law enforcement's response to peaceful protest was unmistakable, and Leon, despite his dedication to the law, became an example of the very system he had been fighting against. Judge Montgomery's handling of the case revealed clear bias against the defendant. His decisions were swift and uncompromising, consistently favoring the police officers involved in the arrest. Despite the defense's repeated requests to introduce critical exculpatory evidence, the judge dismissed each motion without hesitation, citing procedural technicalities or irrelevant factors. Leon's objections to the handling of the evidence were overruled with little consideration, further highlighting the one-sided nature of the proceedings. As the trial progressed, it became evident that Judge Montgomery's perspective on the case was shaped by his previous career as a prosecutor. His history with law enforcement influenced his view of the case, leading him to favor the testimony of the officers over any challenge to their credibility. This predisposition affected the impartiality of his rulings. When Leon tried to present contradictions in the officers' accounts or highlight discrepancies in the case against him, the judge swiftly rejected such arguments as unfounded. His manner conveyed not just a belief in the officer's testimony, but a disregard for any evidence or argument that could potentially disrupt the status quo. The prosecution, fully aware of the judge's alignment, capitalized on his bias. They presented their case with unwavering confidence, knowing that their narrative would be upheld. Each officer's testimony, no matter how flawed or contradictory, was accepted without question. The defense, on the other hand, struggled to get a fair hearing for its evidence. As the judge continued to block their motions, the disparity in treatment became glaringly obvious. During a recess, Leon spoke briefly with a fellow lawyer in the hallway, acknowledging the stakes of the case. He had been a respected figure in civil rights law, known for challenging systemic inequalities within the justice system. But as his influence grew, so did the resistance from those within the establishment who felt threatened by his activism. Powerful individuals, judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement viewed his efforts as a challenge to their authority and the system they upheld. This personal conflict was now at the forefront of the case. The arrest, the charges, and the entire trial were no longer just about one man's actions at a protest. They represented a larger fight between a system determined to maintain its power and an individual willing to risk everything to expose its flaws. Leon had been a rising star in legal circles, and his past successes in cases that fought for civil rights had earned him a reputation. However, his recent work challenging police practices, Advocating for marginalized communities and speaking out against institutional corruption had made him enemies. His legal approach, which often involved publicizing the failings of those in power, had struck a nerve with the very people now overseeing his case. They saw his case as not just a legal matter but a personal one, where the stakes were much higher than the outcome of this particular trial. As Leon sat back in the courtroom, it became clearer that this was not just a battle for his freedom, it was a battle for the integrity of the justice system itself. The judge's bias and the prosecutor's relentless pursuit of conviction demonstrated the deep-rooted challenges within the legal system, where personal interests and institutional protection often overshadow the pursuit of truth and justice. Leon's relentless pursuit of justice led him to a discovery buried deep within the courtroom records. He had been combing through the case files, searching for inconsistencies and overlooked details that might turn the tide in his favor. Amidst the stack of paperwork, he found a file that had been purposely overlooked by both the prosecution and the judge. It contained an email thread that seemed innocuous at first, but its implications were far more serious. The emails were exchanged between Judge Montgomery and Officer Ramirez, both discussing the case in a manner that raised significant questions about their impartiality. The tone of the messages suggested a much deeper connection between the two men than a simple professional relationship. The content of the emails revealed that they had previously collaborated on various police-related issues, including defending controversial tactics that had come under public scrutiny. The exchange also indicated that Montgomery had provided guidance to Ramirez on how to handle specific legal situations, which was highly inappropriate and unethical, given the judge's role in presiding over cases involving law enforcement officers. In one email, Ramirez mentioned a particular protest in which he had used aggressive tactics to subdue demonstrators, tactics that had been widely criticized in the media. Montgomery's response was not only approving, but also included advice on how to better handle similar situations in the future. It was clear that the judge had a vested interest in ensuring that police actions, especially those that had sparked public outrage, were not scrutinized too heavily in the courtroom. These emails were a smoking gun, confirming that Montgomery's judgment in this case was compromised by his ongoing relationship with Ramirez and his defense of questionable police conduct. Leon's pulse quickened as he reviewed the evidence. This could be the leverage he needed to not only expose the bias in the trial, but to also demand Montgomery's recusal. The documents were explosive, revealing a clear conflict of interest that no judge should ever have allowed to influence a legal proceeding. With this information, Leon could potentially discredit both Montgomery and Ramirez, turning the case in his favor. However, Leon knew he needed to be strategic. He couldn't reveal these emails prematurely. Doing so could backfire if the evidence wasn't presented at the right moment. Before he could decide on his next move, the prosecutor, sensing an opportunity, called for a sudden motion. He presented more so-called evidence that painted Leon as the ringleader of the protest, accusing him of orchestrating the violence that had broken out during the demonstration. The prosecutor cited testimony from the officers who had arrested Leon, all of which depicted him as a belligerent instigator. As the prosecutor outlined the fabricated charges, he shot Leon a smug look, fully aware that the judge would likely accept these claims without question. The prosecutor's tactics were transparent. They weren't focused on presenting facts or uncovering the truth. Instead, they were determined to make an example of Leon, a lawyer who had dared to challenge the established system. The prosecutor had already secured the judge's support, and they knew that their narrative would hold weight in front of a jury that was likely predisposed to favor law enforcement. They pushed forward relentlessly, presenting one piece of evidence after another, none of which stood up to scrutiny. It didn't matter. The goal wasn't to prove guilt. It was to paint Leon as the enemy, someone who threatened the status quo. Leon listened intently, watching as the prosecutor attempted to shift the narrative entirely. His words were carefully chosen to manipulate the jury's perception, portraying Leon as a dangerous radical who sought to destabilize the very fabric of society. The prosecutor's ability to twist facts into a compelling story made it clear. This was never about justice. This was about maintaining control and silencing anyone who dared to question authority. As the prosecutor spoke, Leon's mind raced. The emails could destroy the foundation of this entire case, but he had to bide his time. He couldn't allow the prosecutor's attempt to sway the jury to go unanswered. Leon's legal strategy was clear. He needed to expose the corruption at the heart of this trial without giving the prosecutor the chance to discredit him. It would require precision, timing, and a deep understanding of the law. While the prosecutor continued his assault, Leon remained composed, carefully considering his next move. The emails were critical, but Leon knew that presenting them prematurely could result in the case being dismissed on technical grounds. He would need to wait for the right moment, ensuring that he could fully leverage the information without jeopardizing his defense. The fight was far from over, and Leon was determined to come out on top. As the trial drew closer to its conclusion, the defense was in a precarious position. The prosecution's case was built on a narrative that painted Leon Carter as the aggressor, the instigator of violence at a protest that had spiraled out of control. Despite Leon's repeated efforts to counter their claims with evidence of his own innocence, the mounting pressure in the courtroom made it seem as though the walls were closing in. The judge's bias, combined with the weight of the prosecution's relentless accusations, created a sense of inevitability, as if the system itself was working against him. In a quiet moment before the proceedings resumed, Leon found himself reflecting on the trial's progression. The facts had been twisted, the evidence distorted, and the focus had shifted from the truth to the desire for a quick conviction. But one piece of evidence remained, something that had not yet been brought to light: the body cam footage from Officer Mendez, a law enforcement officer who had been present at the protest, but whose footage had somehow been withheld from the trial. The footage clearly showed the officers using excessive force against the demonstrators, including moments where the officers deliberately provoked the crowd. This footage directly contradicted the prosecution's narrative, showing that Leon had not incited the violence but had, in fact, attempted to defuse the situation. It was a key piece of evidence that could turn the tide of the case, but it had been hidden from the defense. Leon reviewed the footage once again in his mind. Officer Mendez's camera had captured the very moment when the first push from law enforcement occurred, an aggressive move that escalated the peaceful protest into chaos. Leon was seen stepping between officers and protesters, trying to calm the situation, but the brutality of the response left little room for reasoning. The footage was damning, a clear visual representation of the truths, something the prosecution had worked hard to suppress. Leon knew that presenting this evidence was the only way to challenge the false narrative the prosecution had created. When the trial resumed, Leon made a bold decision. He requested an immediate hearing to present the body cam footage as new evidence, a request he knew would be met with resistance. Judge Montgomery, however, dismissed him without hesitation, citing the trial's advanced stage and stating that it was too late to introduce new evidence. The judge's refusal was not surprising, given his earlier rulings, but it left Leon no choice but to press further. Leon stood, his voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, the body cam footage from Officer Mendez is vital to this case. It directly contradicts the testimony we've heard, and it shows that the officers were the aggressors. It's not too late to introduce it. It's necessary for the truth to be heard." Judge Montgomery's response was quick and dismissive. "The trial is nearing its end, Mr. Carter. We've already heard the evidence. There's no room for new material at this point." His tone was final, leaving little room for debate. But Leon wasn't about to let the judge's ruling silence him. He had spent years fighting for justice, and this case would not be another example of a corrupt system dismissing the truth. He paused for a moment, assessing his options, knowing that his time was running out. Then, without warning, he stood up again, this time with more force. "Enough." Leon's voice rang out across the courtroom, cutting through the tension that had built over the course of the trial. His words were not just a response to the judge's ruling. They were an assertion of his right to be heard, to demand justice. "You all know what happened that day. The officers provoked us. I was trying to de-escalate the situation, but they pushed back. And now you're trying to bury the truth. You're trying to ignore the evidence that proves I did nothing wrong." The room fell silent as Leon's words echoed in the courtroom. For a moment, everyone seemed taken aback. The judge, usually composed and authoritative, appeared momentarily unsettled by Leon's outburst. The prosecutor, who had long believed the case was in the bag, shifted uneasily in his seat. Even the jury seemed to be considering Leon's words more carefully than they had before. Leaning forward, Leon continued, his tone unwavering. "This case is not about whether I was part of the protest. It's about whether the truth matters. You've heard testimony that was biased, fabricated, and designed to paint me as a criminal. But this footage shows exactly what happened. It shows that I was trying to stop the violence, not start it." Leon could feel the weight of his words. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom now. He was fighting for the integrity of the legal system, for the right of every citizen to be treated fairly, and for the acknowledgement that the truth should always prevail. Judge Montgomery remained silent, his expression unreadable. Leon could see the hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. But it was quickly masked by the judge's usual stern demeanor. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice now measured, "your outburst is inappropriate. You will be held in contempt." If you continue, Leon did not back down. "I'm not here to be quiet. I'm here to make sure that the truth doesn't get buried. This isn't about me or the charges against me. This is about every single person who's ever been wronged by this system. If I don't speak up now, what kind of message are we sending? The courtroom remained still, the air thick with the unspoken question of whether the truth would be allowed to prevail. The judge hesitated again, clearly considering the implications of Leon's argument. Finally, after a long pause, Montgomery spoke. The court will recess for 15 minutes. I will review your request. As the room began to stir, Leon remained standing, his eyes fixed on the judge. The momentum had shifted, however slightly. For the first time in the trial, Leon could see that his persistence had made an impact. The judge's decision would be crucial. Leon knew that this was his last chance. If the footage was allowed into evidence, it could expose the entire case for what it was: a biased prosecution built on falsehoods. If not, he would have to live with the consequences of a broken system. But he was prepared for that. For Leon, this was not just about winning the case, it was about ensuring that the system, flawed as it might be, was held accountable. The moment of confrontation had passed, but the fight was far from over. The battle for justice would continue. Leon's calculated approach shifted the dynamics of the courtroom. He had been careful with his timing, waiting for the right moment to reveal the information that had the potential to dismantle the case against him. The moment arrived when the judge attempted to shut him down once again, dismissing his requests and ignoring the mounting evidence that challenged the prosecution's narrative. Leaning forward, Leon addressed the court, his voice steady and firm, yet with a hint of conviction that demanded attention. I'm not just any civil rights lawyer, he said. I've been fighting systemic injustice for years, using the law to expose the cracks in this very system. What you don't know is that I have friends, allies, and the law itself on my side, and I know what you did. The courtroom went silent. The sudden shift in Leon's demeanor drew the attention of every person present. The weight of his words hung in the air, and the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. Judge Montgomery's expression, usually composed, shifted slightly. There was no visible sign of fear, but the judge's face did pale, just enough to be noticed by those paying attention. The revelation, though cryptic, was powerful enough to make even the most seasoned legal professionals in the room uneasy. Leon did not allow the moment to pass. He pulled out a file, one that had been concealed. Until now, with deliberate care, he placed the documents on the table in front of him. The papers were simple, but their implications were anything but. He addressed the judge directly, his voice unwavering. These emails were exchanged between you and Officer Ramirez. They discuss the very case at hand, and what's in these communications calls into question your impartiality, your involvement, and your motives in this trial. Leon unfolded the papers and held them up for the court to see, the weight of his next words hanging in the balance. Here, in black and white, you can see how you and Officer Ramirez coordinated on matters far outside the scope of your professional roles. Your relationship was more than just a casual exchange of information. It's clear from these emails that you provided guidance on handling specific legal situations, and not just any situations, those involving protests, those involving me. This isn't just about corruption. This is about collusion. The room remained still. Every person in the courtroom was now fully aware of the gravity of what had just been revealed. The email exchange between Judge Montgomery and Officer Ramirez was explicit. It outlined plans for handling protests, shared opinions on how to manage civil disobedience, and included details that were never meant to be disclosed. The language used was casual, but the nature of the communication was anything but ordinary. It revealed an improper relationship between the judge and the officer, one that was both unethical and potentially illegal. Judge Montgomery, who had appeared so steadfast in his rulings up until this point, now seemed to hesitate. The revelation was not just about Leon's innocence, it was a direct challenge to the integrity of the entire legal process. Leon's voice cut through the silence. Again, this isn't just about me. This is about the corruption in this courtroom. This is about the lengths to which you and Officer Ramirez went to ensure that I was wrongfully convicted, and I won't stand for it. The prosecutor, who had been confident in securing a conviction, stood frozen. The case they had worked so diligently to present was now crumbling in front of their eyes. They scrambled for a response, but none came. The momentum had shifted completely in Leon's favor. Even the jury, who had been quietly observing the trial's developments, began to stir. The implications of the email exchange were undeniable. What had once seemed like a straightforward case of protest-related violence now appeared to be a well-orchestrated attempt to silence a civil rights lawyer by using the very system that was meant to protect the public. Leon pressed on, his voice gaining strength with each word. You've made this personal. You've attacked me, not because I broke the law, but because I challenged the system. You've tried to destroy my reputation, to ruin my career, because I've dared to stand up for the rights of others. But I'm not going to let you get away with it." Judge Montgomery remained silent, his face betraying the slightest flicker of discomfort. But he was still unwilling to acknowledge the severity of the situation. Leon knew this wasn't enough. He had to push further. He knew this case wasn't about me, it was about setting an example, using me as a pawn in your own game. But you didn't count on the truth coming to light. And now, there's no turning back. The courtroom's atmosphere was electric. The entire case had turned on its head. The room, once controlled by the judge and the prosecutor, was now filled with uncertainty. Everyone understood that the stakes had just changed. The revelations were enough to cast doubt on the integrity of the entire trial. And the power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted in Leon's favor. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Judge Montgomery was going to respond, but the weight of the accusations seemed to paralyze him. The courtroom waited in silence, the truth now exposed for all to see. Leon's voice rang out one final time, aimed directly at the judge. "I have one simple request, Your Honor. Recuse yourself from this case. You are no longer fit to preside over this trial. Your bias is clear, and your involvement in this corruption is undeniable." The judge's face remained neutral, but there was no mistaking the fact that Leon's words had struck a significant blow to the judge's credibility. The prosecutor, having lost all ground, began to speak, but their words faltered in the face of Leon's decisive move. The courtroom was in disarray, and the legal process, which had seemed so certain moments earlier, was now on the verge of unraveling. The truth had emerged, and there was no denying it. What had started as an attempt to silence one man had, instead, uncovered the very corruption that had pervaded the trial from the start. The courtroom was no longer a place of authority, but a battleground where justice was being fought for in the most unexpected way. The judge had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. The truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back. Judge Montgomery's attempt to deny the damning evidence presented by the defense quickly fell apart. The email exchange between him and Officer Ramirez, combined with the body cam footage, exposed an undeniable conflict of interest. There was no refuting the direct involvement of the judge in the orchestration of events that led to Leon's arrest. The evidence was clear, and even the most seasoned legal professionals in the courtroom could not ignore its implications. Leon's assertions were not just accusations. They were backed by irrefutable documentation that shattered the narrative the prosecution had worked so tirelessly to build. The judge, who had earlier dismissed any challenge to his authority and decisions, now found himself cornered. As lawyer continued to outline the undeniable facts, Montgomery began to falter. His earlier confidence dissolved into a quiet realization that his position in this trial was no longer tenable. The emails were only the beginning. The body cam footage added another layer, and the lack of impartiality had become too glaring to ignore. The case, once seemingly certain for conviction, had now turned into a glaring display of judicial misconduct and corruption. In a surprising turn, Judge Montgomery recused himself from the case. His decision was a calculated one, understanding that his continued involvement could lead to a professional downfall. The weight of the accusations against him, the apparent bias, the collusion with law enforcement, and the obstruction of justice would not only lead to a mistrial but could permanently damage his career. It was clear that he had no choice but to step aside, acknowledging that his presence in the courtroom was now a liability to the integrity of the legal process. With the judge's recusal, the prosecution found itself scrambling. Without the bias of Judge Montgomery to rely on, the foundation of their case collapsed. The evidence they had presented suddenly seemed far less credible, and their arguments, once seemingly airtight, now appeared weak and disjointed. The prosecutor, who had once believed that Leon's conviction was a foregone conclusion, now struggled to maintain any semblance of control. The momentum had shifted entirely, and the case was slipping through their fingers. The legal system, which had been stacked against Leon from the outset, was now turning in his favor. The charges against him, based on fabricated evidence and a prejudiced legal process, were formally dropped. The prosecutor, having lost their primary ally in the judge, had no choice but to concede. Leon was free from the false accusations, but the victory was bittersweet. While he had won this battle, the war against a deeply entrenched system of bias and corruption was far from over. This victory, though significant, was only a small part of a much larger fight. Leon, his face, weary but resolute, stood tall as he left the courtroom. The weight of the trial had been immense, but the outcome represented something more than just the end of this particular case. It was a testament to his unwavering commitment to justice. Even when faced with overwhelming odds, he knew that this small victory could serve as a catalyst for larger change. that exposing the flaws within the system could inspire others to stand up and demand accountability. As Leon walked out of the courtroom, his thoughts were already shifting to the next challenge. The fight for justice was far from over. One case, one victory, would not be enough to dismantle the systemic corruption he had uncovered. But this moment, this victory, could spark something greater. It could awaken others to the truth and inspire a movement for change. The path ahead would be difficult, and there would be more obstacles to overcome. But Leon was ready. Outside the courtroom, Leon encountered Officer Ramirez, the same officer who had arrested him, the same officer whose actions had been integral to the false narrative that nearly destroyed him, now stood before him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was no animosity. Ramirez, once a staunch defender of the system he had been a part of, seemed disillusioned, his earlier confidence replaced by doubt. It was clear that the events of the trial had shaken him. Leon's gaze softened as he looked at Ramirez. It was not a moment of triumph or vindication, but a moment of understanding. "You don't have to be part of this," Leon said quietly. "You don't have to keep supporting a system that hurts people." Ramirez didn't answer immediately. His expression was conflicted, torn between his duty as an officer and the unsettling reality of the corruption he had witnessed in the courtroom. Leon had already exposed the truth of the system, but now it was up to others, those like Ramirez, to decide where they stood. For the first time, Ramirez seemed to question his role in the larger system, his faith in the institution beginning to crack. Justice had been served in this case, but it was clear that the battle was ongoing. Leon's victory had come at a high cost, but it had exposed cracks in a system that many believed to be impenetrable. The road to lasting change would be difficult, but the small victories, the ones that started in courtrooms like this one, were the foundation of a larger movement that would demand accountability and reform. As Leon left the courthouse, he knew that his work was far from done, but with each victory, no matter how small, the system would be pushed one step closer to real change. He was no longer just a lawyer in a case. He was part of a larger movement, one that would continue to fight for justice, transparency, and reform. The end of this trial marked the beginning of something greater, and Leon was ready to face whatever came next.